My name is Cora Preston. I'm the network manager for the Switzer Foundation, and I'm really excited to welcome you all here today. Before we get started, I would like to share about the Switzer Foundation's land acknowledgement and reparations process. We recognize that there are differing best practices around land acknowledgement statements, and the foundation has committed to making financial contributions to Indigenous-led organizations connected to each event we hold, in addition to acknowledging the past and present injustices that allow us to occupy their lands. The recipient of today's contribution is Native Women's Wilderness. I'll share a link to learn more about them in the chat, and as well as our full land acknowledgement statement, recognizing that the Switzer Foundation office resides on occupied Penobscot territory. We welcome input and conversation about this, so please reach out to me or any member of staff if you have ideas, resources, or feedback on this. I'll just drop those links in the chat now. And our event today is going to last for 1 hour and 45 minutes. We encourage you to do whatever you need to feel comfortable throughout the event, your camera on or off, getting up to stretch, and whatever you need. Carolyn's talk at the beginning of the event will be recorded, and then we'll stop recording when we transition into the fireside chat and Q&A discussion. The intent with the fireside chat is to help us more comfortably transition from the deep topics that Carolyn will present in her talk to an open and safe discussion space for this group. Lisa will ask Carolyn a couple of questions in this session to get us started, and then we'll move into the open-ended Q&A with attendees. And we'll ask you to hold your questions until the Q&A portion of the event, when you'll be able to raise your hand via Zoom and be called on to ask a question. I encourage you to jot down your questions as we go on a notepad so that you don't forget them. And feel free to introduce yourselves and connect with each other via the chat. If you have any tech questions throughout the event, you can send me or Lane a chat and we'll do our best to help out. And lastly, I'd like to say a big thank you to Lisa Stoddard, the Switzer Fellow who's been working with Carolyn to organize this event and is part of the leadership team this year for the Race and Equity Discussion Group. So thank you so much, Lisa, and I'll turn it over to you now to get us started.
Great. Hi, all. It's wonderful to see so many people here and some names and faces that I recognize. That's great. I'm a 2013 Switzer Fellow, and I started out working with Karen Andrade to work on bringing Carolyn to talk with everyone. So it's my absolute great pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Carolyn Finney. Carolyn is a storyteller, author, and cultural geographer who's grounded both in artistic and intellectual ways of knowing. She pursued an acting career for 11 years, but 5 years of backpacking trips through Africa and Asia and living in Nepal changed the course of her life. Carolyn returned to school after a 15-year absence to complete a BA, MA, and PhD. She was a Fulbright and Canon National Science Scholar Fellow. Along with public speaking, writing, media engagements, consulting, and teaching, Carolyn served on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014. She's currently working on a new book, which is a more personal journey into the complicated relationship between race, land, and belonging in the United States, and a performance piece entitled The N-Word, Nature Revisited as part of an Andrew W. Mellon residency at the New York Botanical Gardens Humanities Institute. Along with being a columnist at the Earth Island Journal, Carolyn was recently awarded the Alexander and Isle Melamed Medal from the American Geographical Society and is an artist in residence in the Franklin Environmental Center at Middlebury College. I'm thrilled to have Carolyn here. It's been wonderful getting to know her over the last few weeks, and I'm excited for us all to get started. Thank you, Carolyn.
That was me going, woohoo! You just didn't hear it when I first said it. Thank you, Lisa, for thank you just for reaching out and inviting me here. Thank you to Cora. Thank you to everyone actually who is here making space for me to be in conversation with you about some topics that I know that can be really challenging. But here we are, and here they are. So I have some things to say about that. yeah, I have a few things I want to say about that. What I want to do is put up some images. So for about 45 minutes, give or take a few, I want to put some things on the table so that we can then have some conversation. I don't want to bypass the fact that I'm speaking to you from Burlington, Vermont, the traditional home of the Abenaki people. I'm sort of working, we can have a conversation about land acknowledgement, but speaking with a Abenaki woman here, sometimes it's Abenaki, she says Abenaki, her name is Judy Dow. She reminded me that land acknowledgement, because I was uncomfortable. I didn't want to just seem like I was saying the thing, like, but if I don't say anything, what does that mean? And she reminded me that, it's about relationship. From her perspective, that's what it is. So you just kind of start where you are with what you have. I just kind of want to put that out there. I also want to recognize that I was told there's a really diverse group of people coming today, and diverse in all kinds of ways, in terms of age, experience, how you know this work, how you do this work, how you see yourself in the world. And so I was really thinking about that as I was putting together the way that I want to hold this conversation. And you see my title here, Holding Multitudes, Being Black, Dreaming Green, and Playing the Long Game. And yeah, so I'm trying to pack a lot of things in there in a layered way, hoping to give us a lot of juicy stuff with which to have this conversation. Excuse me, and this is my allergies, just so you know what's going on with me here. They are in full force right now. Let me get to the next one. So I was listening to, when I listened to the bio that Lisa was reading, which of course was the bio that I sent, it's the one that I sent. And I was thinking about, even I get tired listening to it. I mean, I'm happy about it. I feel strange about it, but I also am tired about it. And since 2020, this is probably the 200th time, maybe more, that I've engaged with people in a variety of ways around this topic. And this is the work that I do. I've been building this public platform for some time. And so I'm going to go back and forth on this. I talk about systemic racism, diversity, environment, and inclusion, race, belonging in the environment. There's a whole lot of things that I talk about. I advise about it. I talk about it. I tell story about it. I write about it. I get interviewed about it. And I have to tell you that I feel a way about that. So there's a part of me that feels really grateful for that I get to make a living, pay my rent, doing something that I care about, that I'm engaged with all the time, that I'm really passionate about. It's something that my parents weren't able to do. I think it's something that the majority of the world isn't necessarily able to choose to do, to get paid for something that they love to do and that they believe in all the time. I'm also exhausted and I'm stressed a lot about it because there's a lot of emotional labor involved. For me, that's not a complaint. It's just a reality. And how do I hold those things, right? The fact that I can be exhausted, that for me, when I do this work, wherever I go, there I am, right? And so what does it mean to put this on the table in that way, in a way that is hopefully resonant for people, that invites them to consider their own position. But at the same time, that I also, every time I do that, right, there's a little something, there's a little piece of me that goes out there in a very particular way. And so what does that require? So when I was thinking about this, and I put up here meeting people where they are, because part of my own practice in doing this kind of work is, how do I do that? How do I meet people where they are? And I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm not just saying that because I like to think of myself as such a nice and kind person. I like to think that I can be those things, and I always strive to be those things. But I also put that up there because I'm hoping people will meet me where I am, right? It's about a relationship. So trying to really understand, how do I help to create that context that allows whoever I'm meeting where they are, like you all today, make space for myself as well. So, talking to Lisa about, what are the things that the organization's thinking about? What are the things, who are the people in the organization, the fellows? How are you all showing up to this moment? I wanted to talk a little bit. I'm not going to talk specifically about the book, Black Faces, White Spaces, but I've taken ideas and how that's evolved to this point and my engagement with that subject matter. So I'm sort of weaving in and out with that in a very particular way. Why did I write this book in the first place? And I am a person who's always curious about who the author is on anything, right? Because I believe that all knowledge is subjective. that we bring all of who we are to bear up on anything it is that we're trying to understand, right? Wherever we go, there we are. And I want to know a little something about that. So I feel it's only fair that I tell you this. You know, there's a few things that I will say throughout this talk that kind of get at why I talk about it. But what I will say to you just in the short version right now is that in 2003, when I was working on my doctorate in geography at Clark University, I was originally doing my doctorate when I got to Fulbright. I was actually looking at Nepal, gender and conservation there. You know, this was in 2001, 2002. And for political reasons within the country of Nepal, I wasn't actually able to do my research. The royal family had been assassinated. I was doing work at a 10,000-foot village in a conservation area that I could only get to twice because of the Maoists had broke a ceasefire that had been in place. There was just a lot going on. I lasted 7 months, could only get to my research area twice. So I really had to rethink. But what is also true, when I started doing my doctoral dissertation and really getting exposed to all the theory and all the ways of thinking about conservation and race and gender and difference and identity and belonging, you know, I couldn't help but think about race because I'm African American, right? I was coming to the table and wondering where I was. And I started thinking about Black people in the environment. And when I came back from Nepal, my advisor really pushed me. She said, this is the dissertation you should do because nobody's doing it. And I wanted to do it, but I was really afraid because when somebody tells you that nobody's doing it, you can feel one of two ways. You can get like, ooh, good, you know, I can get in there and, oh shit, excuse the expression, but that means that I've got to carry that myself in a very particular way. And what does that mean to do that? I got incredibly frustrated because the first thing I did is I went to the library shelves, right? You got to see what's there on your subject matter. I hardly found anything on Black people in the environment, except the bad things that happen to Black communities because of what may be happening to the environment. And like any group of people, we're not only the bad things that happen to us. So that in and of itself was incredibly frustrating, though there was a ton of stuff in there. There was nature writing, there was environmental science, there was all kinds of stories, fictional and non-fictional, biography about people's experience in the environment, just not about Black people, right? So that was really, at its core, the first thing that got me interested and engaged and why I wanted to write it. And I'm going to tell you a little later about something else that was going on with my family that really drives me and is at the center of the way that I do this work. But I have this image up here from the artist Ruud van Empel. It's called World, and the phrase "a door in a mirror." About a year ago, I read an article in the Paris Review. It was by a Black writer. Her name was Maura Cheeks. And the article is called, Isn't Black Representation What We Wanted? Isn't Black Representation What We Wanted? And in it, she talks about Fran Lebowitz, the Jewish thinker and writer who, you know, and public speaker, who asked the question, why does everyone want to see themselves in books? She asked that question, why does everyone want to see themselves in books? At the time, Fran Lebowitz was in conversation with the director, Martin Scorsese, and she said she doesn't understand people who complain about not seeing themselves in books. What she says is, quote, a book is not supposed to be a mirror. It's supposed to be a door, end quote. So Maura Cheeks, the Black writer, says in response, quote, I understand the sentiment, but I disagree with the argument. It's the type of sentiment that can only be felt by someone who was unknowingly represented almost everywhere she turned. She didn't know what she had, end quote. Later on in the article, Fran Lebowitz gets in conversation with the Black writer Toni Morrison, and she brings it up again. And Toni Morrison says, Lebowitz says to Toni Morrison, your other readers aren't you. And Toni Morrison just laughs and says, yes, they are. She says, I am the reader of the books I write, right? So I think about that question of representation, my desire to see myself and others who look like me also engaged in the stories. Because of course, it rolls into that big myth that, well, if the stories aren't there, then we're not actually involved. We're not actually there. And I think this is true for a number of different groups of people. But I was thinking very particularly about African Americans and really pushed to challenge, why do you have, you know, the stories and narratives of people like Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Rachel Carson, all interesting, committed, and thoughtful people. I'm not at all talking about canceling them. I'm not all here to denigrate them and their work and their commitment. but suddenly their stories become universalized. And the thread that's true on all three of them is that they are white. That's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing, but it's a true thing. And that, when you talk about the way whiteness has been centered in this country for 400 years, whiteness is diverse. And I like to really point out that for me, I follow the way James Baldwin thinks about it, which is whiteness is about power. Right? It's not about bad or good, but to understand that when you can universalize a story that way, the rest of us gets subsumed in there. And actually the reality of how we live those experiences differently also becomes erased, ignored, et cetera, et cetera. And I really wanted to challenge that. The other thing that I sort of skipped over one piece here, but I'm going to say it first. I'm going to come back to it. I'll leave this up here for a second. Is that about a year ago, I watched a documentary called True Justice on HBO, and it was about the incredible, I think he's so incredible, the civil rights lawyer, African-American lawyer, Bryan Stevenson. And some of you may have heard about Bryan Stevenson. He helped to start back in Alabama. There's the big lynching exhibit that he has done. He's been to the Supreme Court 5 times. He works to get Black men and sometimes Black teenagers off death row. There's been a movie made about him with Michael B. Jordan. I always joke around and say the dude from Wakanda, and what I really mean is the movie Black Panther, who plays him in real life. And I hadn't really known much about him until I watched the documentary, but I was really blown away by who he was. What really struck me were a number of things. I discovered that he and I were the same age. We were both 62. We were born exactly one day apart. We're both, at least at the time he made that film, single. We don't have children, and we work all the time. That's what we do. That's what he does. The interviewer said to him, so why do you do what you do? And his first response was, well, I do what I do because the system is broken. And then he paused a little bit, and then he said, well, I do what I do because people are broken. And then he paused again, and he said, well, I do what I do because I'm broken too. And that laid me out. You know, I tell audiences this a lot this past year because I really understood for me how true all those things were. And at the core, fundamentally, that I'm also doing it because I'm broken too. And what does that mean then to come to this work with that intact, like holding that there at the same time that you're doing this work? Maybe 10 years ago or so, I was standing in an airport. I think it was at SFO in San Francisco, and I was getting ready to board a plane, and there was a South Asian woman standing in front of me, 2 white women standing behind me. And as we're about to get on, a flight attendant comes out and says, there's a delay. And so when she says that, the 4 of us start talking to each other the way you often do when that happens. And somehow it came up, I started talking about what I do, the question of diversity, race, environment, and one of the 2 white women said, you know, it's so important to be empathetic. And I nodded like, yeah, it's really important to have empathy. Well, the South Asian woman didn't crack a smile, and she looked at all of us. She was physically smaller than us, but there was something really, she kind of frightened me a little bit in a good way, because she was clearly indomitable, like the way she stood there. And she looked at the 3 of us and she said, you know, my work is that I go around to businesses all around the world to talk about diversity and inclusion. She goes, I've been to 75 countries to have that conversation. Empathy and sympathy are nice, but who do you stand with? And she did, that's it. She didn't provide an answer. She just gave us that information. The minute I got on the plane, I wrote it down, right? Because I was like, wow, I mean, it's simple. But the question of who do you stand with? And 2 things about that. In order to know who you stand with, you first have to know and be honest with where it is you stand. And I'm not talking about defending where you stand, but the question for me is that we all have bias. We are all biased. Bias isn't a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It is what it is. We have a point of view based on who we are, where we grew up, our own experience in our lives, our own traumas in our lives. But we have to know where it is we stand. But something I only started doing recently, and I wanted to make sure I said it today, is that, so I'd say, so who do you stand with? You have to know where it is you stand, but also who stands with you? And sometimes, up until recently, I had never gotten to that point in the conversation to consider that to come to this work, to be in right relationship, means that we also need to know who stands with us in order to do this work, right? Because for me, there's not really anything easy about doing this work. So I want to come back to what I think is the primary reason with why I do this work. So, so in knowing where I stand and how I come to this work, I tell people, you know, wherever I go, there I am, right? I kind of bring myself with me. I can't do anything about it. I joke around and say, I can't be incognito, right? I walk into a room, people may not know exactly what's going on here, but they know something that's going on here. But I believe I bring with me 400 years of all that stuff that kind of hangs in the ether, that's often brushed under the carpet, that's often denied, that's often dismissed, that's often erased, that's not necessarily represented. And for 100 different reasons, right? It comes in the room with me, right? This isn't meant to feel sorry for me or anything like that. It's like, it's just there, whether I like it or not, right? Which also means that it informs my perspective. I can't, I mean, it informs my perspective in a myriad of ways. I've lost jobs because of it. I've been denied, I've been strip searched coming into this country because of it. I have so many things that have happened because of that history that continue to happen. I just had a week and a half ago, a white woman sitting next to me on the plane that thought it was all right to ask me about my hair, and she couldn't help herself. And she kept going on about how my hair didn't look real. And she just kept, and she was really nice. It just happens all the time, right? So yes, it informs my perspective, but I think that the real beginning for that was where I grew up. And I've told this story many times, but it's the way that I had to come to this and invite you to consider, right, your own story as well. So my parents, Rose and Henry, this picture was taken in the 50s. They grew up in Floyd, Virginia. They grew up very poor, large Black families. They both have a high school education. My father went off to fight in the Korean War. And when he came back from the Korean War, he was looking for a job. They had gotten married, he was looking for a job. And in the state of Virginia, he said he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform, and he thought that looked like a great government job. So he wanted to apply. This was during Jim Crow segregation. And what the park ranger told him is, I'm sorry, but we don't hire Negroes. So my parents, like a lot of Black people that time in the South, decided to come north as part of the Great Migration, and they came to New York. And in New York, in the state, he got 2 job offers. One was in Syracuse, New York, which was 5 hours north of the city, where he could have been a janitor. But the other that he ended up taking was only 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. A very wealthy Jewish family owned a 12-acre estate. And these are the pictures that you're going to see here for the next couple of minutes. The 12-acre estate had a swimming pool, a lake, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, peach, pear, apple trees. They had woods, rocks. There are 2 houses on this property. They needed full-time caretakers for this estate. And so my parents took that job. My father was the chauffeur. He was the gardener. My mother was the sometime housekeeper. The owners only came up mostly on weekends and holidays. So this place, this is the gardener's cottage that I grew up in. I'll show you what I call the big house. You can see the roof there in the background in a moment. My parents tried to have kids. They thought they couldn't have kids. And the reason my mother thought she couldn't have kids was something that happens, I think, to poor women from all ethnic and racial backgrounds in this country. She had gone in to have a cyst removed from one of her ovaries. And without asking her permission, they just moved another one of her, they removed the cyst and they removed one of her ovaries. And they told her when she woke up, the reason we didn't ask your permission because we didn't think you could emotionally handle the information. So my mother didn't think she could have kids, which I benefited from because with the help of the owners, they adopted me. And then what I like to say is they relaxed and they had my first brother and they did some more relaxing and they had my second brother. This is the big house that you can see here. So this was in an all-white, very wealthy neighborhood. Harry Winston had property down the street. Wingfoot Golf Club is around the corner. At the time, Schaefer of Schaefer Beer lived right next door to us. We were the only family of color in this neighborhood until the 1990s. A Japanese American woman moved in. She was there for a couple of years and then she moved out. Since the owners only came up mostly on weekends and holidays, me and my brothers had run of this place like it was our own private park. By the time we were 7 years old, we knew how to swim. We had to because of the water on the property. This is where we learned to ride bikes for the first time, play in the woods, be outside, do all those things in terms of building our relationship with that nature, not us, right? That non-human nature and coming to terms with what that is. But the other story, this is where I fished for the first time, learned how to row a boat, all that kind of stuff. I mean, what a privilege to be able to have, this place to do it on. But the other story that I tell audiences is when I was 9 years old. So my brothers and I went to a public school, a Maronic public school, largely Italian-American working class, some African-American working class. And I often walked home from school because in those days, late 60s, early 70s, you could do so pretty safely. And there were always policemen patrolling this neighborhood. And I argue because of the wealth that existed in that neighborhood. I was right around the corner from the house. So 9 years old, fourth grade, had a little afro and I had my little school bag. And the cop, who was a white policeman, stopped me in his car. He asked me where I was going. And I gave him the address. And he just looked at me and he said, "Oh, do you work there?" I'll never forget that because I'm thinking I'm 9. And my response to him was, "No, I live there," kind of confused. And he let me go. And I went home. I told my parents. My father got really angry. He called the police station, gave them hell, and said they should never bother any more brothers again. And they didn't after that. But as an adult, and some of us have heard these stories or experienced, have had stories just like this over and over again. I want to jump ahead into the 90s. So in the 90s, so the patriarch of the family who owned the land had died many years earlier. The matriarch of the land by the 90s had gotten very sick. Now my parents have been caring for this land for full time for almost 40 years. And she knew that, her passing was imminent. And she started thinking about what's going to happen to my parents. Now she considered trying to keep them on this land. This land was worth over $3 million in the 90s. Property taxes were $125,000 a year. It wasn't going to work. And I know she still considered kind of breaking it up, maybe selling a piece of it. She really tried to do it. Her grown children said no. It got very complicated. So at the end of the day, she said, "I'm going to have a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia." And the reason my parents picked Leesburg is because me and my brothers were grown adults at this point. My youngest brother had gotten married, had kids, and was settled in Leesburg. Me and my other brother were moving around too much. So they had a lovely house built for them. When the owner, the matriarch, passed away, she had my father by her bedside. That was her request. And because power, relationships are complicated. The new owner came on. My parents stayed on for another 5 years until 2003, right back when I was working on this as a dissertation. And he came on in 2003. He wanted my parents to stay on. They're in their 70s, right? It's hard to do this work. Now they've been caring for this land 50 years. So they leave, they move to their new home in Virginia. It's on a half an acre of land. And what I see happen is I watch my father get really depressed. He in particular got really depressed. He talked about missing the land, that these are the best years of his life, on and on. About 5 years after they had been living in their house in Leesburg, they received a copy of a letter. And the letter was from the Westchester Land Trust. The Land Trust was letting everybody in the old neighborhood know that a conservation easement had now been placed on this property. That's why there's now this gate here. And if you were able to zoom in to that little sign, that's saying the Westchester Land Trust on it. Right, because there was never this gate on the driveway before. There were pictures of the property. It was letting everybody know the reason why this land was being protected, the wildlife on this property, where it sits on the watershed, the importance of taking care and protecting this property. At the end of the 2-page letter, which I have a copy of, because the copy was sent to my parents, who then gave it to me, they let everybody know they wanted to thank the new owner for his conservation mindedness. There was nothing in the letter thanking my parents, who'd cared for this land for nearly 50 years. And just like that, they got erased from the environmental history. This is that moment in 2003 that I really understood. This is not just political, this is not just professional, but it is personal. Right? It is personal, because I said, this is what we've been doing for 400 years, this country. The way we can erase people, we can forget people, not necessarily because we're bad people, not necessarily because we're racist people, but just because privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. We've bought into some universal narrative of what we are and who we are, in particular as it relates to the environment, that we do not have to consider the people who didn't own this, but arguably love this land more, that were attached to it every single day, who cared for this land every single day. And just like that stewardship, that work, that love, that presence was gone. So I do what I do because I'm broken too. So I didn't even look at my notes. I had to say that, right? Because I've told this story so much, but I come to this with always the same kind of fervor. And, to be honest with you, it's easy for me to talk about my parents than it is to talk about me in relationship to what this means in terms of never being able to go home. So I bring that to this idea of convergence. And I've put this slide up 1,000 times for people because I think about, the idea that, again, wherever we go, there we are. And so our history, our past is always coming together with the moment that we're in. In the background, really flush on this is the image of George Floyd. But in front of that, wow, we have everything from, the pollution being done to the land, indigenous removal, slavery, Japanese internment, Chinese workers building the railroad, and then also being written initially out of the history. On and on and on. At the same time, we tell stories of those two famous black and white photos, one of Gifford Pinchot, who really founded the idea of conservation and forest management for our use, Yale School of Forestry, all those things came from Gifford Pinchot in the late 1800s, right? I'm not saying it with any judgment, but I think it's important to say it with discernment. The other famous picture of John Muir, the conservationist, and President Roosevelt, 1903, standing in Yosemite on an overhanging rock, having these conversations about wilderness, really coining that term, codifying it in very particular ways, thinking about public lands and national parks. Again, I don't want to judge their conversation as much as I want to discern, because I have to ask what else was going on at the exact same time for other people that didn't look like them. And even for some people who did look like them, what was going on at the same time? And their ability to separate that out so we can tell this universal story about wilderness and national parks and all these things, but we don't have to talk about all these other people who weren't included. And oh, by the way, all this land was stolen. And for me, it doesn't matter how far we get down the road, all this land will always have been stolen. How do we hold that? I put this quote here from Raoul Peck, a Haitian filmmaker. If you haven't seen the two documentary films that I simply love, is one he did a few years ago, I Am Not Your Negro, about the life of James Baldwin and James Baldwin's sort of view of America. But the one that came on HBO last year that laid me out, there's 4 episodes, called Exterminate All the Brutes. Also, again, looking at the history of colonialism and America and also his own life as a Haitian immigrant. It is just, he puts a lot of stuff on the table. Take it one episode at a time, because it's a lot. And I think it's incredibly powerful. But I love this quote, the past has a future we never expect. I think there's a lot embedded in there. But for me, I also ask the question, what is it that we're trying to sustain? I get often frustrated with words like sustainability, because I think a lot of words get overused. I think there's good intention behind the word. But what is it that we mean we're trying to sustain? Because sustainability for me is about relationship. At its core, it is about relationship, not just relationship to a river or a beach or a mountain or a park, but our relationship to each other as it relates to that river, beach, mountain, or park. How do we hold that? And I know for some people, it's easier just to focus on the river, the beach, the mountain, or the park, and not to think about the people. Because thinking about the people means we also have to think about ourselves and our own complicity, our own culpability, because everybody is complicit and culpable in one way or another. Just the way I believe everybody has been traumatized, not to the same extent, not in the same way. Again, privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. Some people are always at the center of that trauma. Some people are right out at the margins of it. But I believe we are all impacted by it. Some of us have a way to duck and weave around that and ignore it and dismiss it because we can. And others of us cannot, right? Because of who we are and how we live our lives. So I'm curious about how we hold that. And again, what is it we're trying to, what is it that we're trying to sustain? I say to people often, actually diversity, equity, and inclusion frustrates me. You know why it frustrates me? Because what is it that we're saying we want to include people in? We're often for me, talking about inclusion, means that we're not being critical about the thing that may already be broken, that we're trying to get people to come into, instead of considering what is emergent and new and different, right? I'll come back to that in a moment. One of the things that I talk about right at the beginning of the book, I borrowed this from Spike Lee on purpose. Spike Lee did a film called Bamboozled, and he was talking about African-American representation in media and TV and how we've been bamboozled to think about Black people in a very particular way. I think we've been bamboozled. Don't try to say that 3 times fast when it comes to talking about the environmental narrative. Because again, there's this universal narrative about who we are and who we've been, and how the environment is and how we should collectively be in relationship to it, that actually denies a very complicated past about who can make these choices. You know, it's not like you can walk into a park and suddenly racism disappeared just because you went to the park. It's not like you can go to the beach and suddenly racism disappeared. I'm going to say it again, or bias, let's be gentler, our kind of bias disappears. An unexamined bias, let me say that. It's not like it disappears. And many of us have experienced this in all of these places through no fault of the beach or no fault of the mountain, right? It's because it's people, right? We're engaged with this. It's systems that people have created, sometimes with the best of intention, sometimes not. Right? Kind of depends on who it is you talk to. So this is where I think we've been bamboozled, that we can place this universal narrative on everybody without considering what it means if you look different. And if you're still unsure about that, we don't even have to go too far in the past. Just talk to Christian Cooper. That's all you got to do, right? You don't even have to go. You don't even have to go to George Floyd. Just go right to Christian Cooper, because when Christian Cooper, as a self-identified gay Black birder, walked into Central Park, Amy Cooper, a white woman, was able to weaponize his skin against him. And I want to be really clear, because I'm not interested in demonizing Amy Cooper. I actually tell people this all the time. I said, if I had a choice of who I could be in conversation with, if I couldn't be in conversation with both of them, and Christian Cooper seems like an amazing man, I hope I get to meet him someday, I'd choose Amy Cooper. Because I'm really interested to see where she is at. I think canceling her out was a huge mistake, because it actually didn't change anything, as far as I'm concerned, that I can see in the system itself. But it might have changed her. And so I'm curious to see what is there, right? How to hold with that. So yes, we have a legacy, right, that continues. For some of us, it's more apparent. You know, I put John Muir there in the background for a lot of different reasons, right? But in part because of that narrative of conservation and environment and preservation and wilderness and protection and nature and, oh, love, sublime, all that stuff, along with Christian Cooper, who I imagine was feeling some of those same things. And also, wherever he goes, there he is. Because the legacy of who we are is there. And these things can happen to you just like that, right? So, you know, I think about the legacy, the history, all those stories, and the stories of now. And there's many other images I could add to this, because since I first made this image in 2020, what was up for me was the murder of George Floyd and everything that unleashed in terms of conversation and possibility and grief and trauma, everything that unleashed at that moment, the pandemic, what that unleashed, and this, in my point of view, this ongoing conversation that somehow we've become more politically divisive. And I want to say that the minute that the minute that Christopher Columbus lost his way, right, it got more politically divisive. We have always been politically divisive. It has always been diverse here. We've got more people and it's gotten more complicated. But this divisiveness is not new. The challenging of a set of universal narratives about who we are has always been challenged. All you got to do is ask any indigenous person. That's all you got to do, right? And then you can also ask some Black people and some Asian people of Asian descent. And actually, you can ask some working class Italian people, and you can ask some Jewish people. Actually, you would ask a whole lot of different kinds of people, right, about that sense of divisiveness, that sense of not feeling like they belong, that sense of having to fight against a narrative, right, that doesn't include, that doesn't embrace, that doesn't consider their full humanity and their experience of that humanity on this, in this country. Woo! I'm revved up. I can't stand up, but I'm revved up. So what do I have up here next? So I say, lately I've been, because one of the things I do is talk with a lot of organizations, institutions, groups, businesses. And a lot of the times they're predominantly white that invite me in. And I say, look, I have big issues with cancel culture. I understand the question of accountability, and I'm all about holding people, organizations, institutions accountable. But, canceling people out and individuals actually, I said, doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't actually, and it doesn't make space for actually healing to take place for everyone involved, including the perpetrator, right? How at any moment, any of us, I would argue, could become the perpetrator, and perhaps we already have, right? And I mean, everybody, any moment, it can happen, right? So what does it mean, right, to actually consider and consider how we might change the way within which that relationship works? So what I tell organizations and institutions in particular is I say, you don't have to throw out the baby in the bathwater. Many people have put in years of real work. Their commitment is serious and real. Their love for the land, the place, the issue that they're pushing is real. Their heart is also in the right place. But I tell them, you have to get rid of the bathtub. This wanting to be included in the same bathtub that is already broken is problematic. If you think you can keep your organization as it is, the structure, right, the mission statement, the focus, the procedures, the rituals, the practices, if you think you can keep them the same, but engage with what many of us are essentially saying, it's something incredibly different, because those procedures, practices, regulations, rules, laws, policies didn't include a lot of people who look like me and a lot of us in this room. Not just about race, also about gender, all the different ways so many of us show up and actually hold those multitudes, right, of who we are. We're complicated and complex, right? So what does that mean in terms of being ready to throw out the bathtub? Oh my God, I have to look at my notes because I got carried away. I want to back up a little bit because I want to go back to this. Ooh, I love when you do that. Let's put it back together in one piece for a second. George Floyd's murder. Last year, when the trial of Derek Chauvin was put on trial and the guilty verdict came down, I was watching CNN, and Jake Tapper is a white journalist, newscaster on the show, was having a conversation with the Black newscaster Don Lemon about it. And Jake Tapper was saying, wow, back in 2016, you couldn't get any political person, any celebrity, any sort of famous white person to say words like Black Lives Matter or white supremacy out loud. Everybody was tiptoeing around it. He said, but today, oh my God, they're all saying it, right? Everybody's saying it. At the time that he said that, Hillary Clinton had just done an opinion piece in the Washington Post where I believe she used white supremacy like 3 times. He's like, they're all saying it. So he said to Don Lemon, so don't you think there has been a sea change because of that? And Don Lemon looked at him and said, well, I think there's been a sea change in terms of awareness and wokeness, but there hasn't been a sea change in terms of practice. And for me, and I think for all of us in the room, and the way that we practice, the way that we do our work, I think awokeness and awareness is part of that journey. And I think it's really important, right? But what does it mean to move past that, through that, beyond that, to practice? What does that look like when it's time to challenge those rules, those regulations? What I wrote here was, but I believe for any practice to work well, for you to meet a person or a community where they are, you've got to be willing to embrace who we've been and challenge the ways and means, the rules and regulations we have institutionalized for doing the work that we do, that at best does not recognize different people, ideas, or experiences, and at worst extracts, transacts, diminishes, and erases ideas, experiences, and ultimately people. And what does that change require? What does it mean to innovate as opposed to simply replicate? Because I think we love to replicate, right? What does it mean to boldly go where you haven't gone before and also look good doing it, So I talk a lot about taking risks in order to gain, because I think we as human beings, are often willing to take a risk in order not to lose something, right? You think about something, it looks like you're about to lose it, so you're going to risk because you want to grab it and hang on to it. But risking to gain is something different, because you actually might not know if you're going to get it, or if it's going to happen, or even what it looks like. It sort of means you have to take a leap out there in a very particular way, and you actually might fail. So I want to go back to asking who stands with you in terms of what a safety net looks like. And for me, safety net, the best kind of safety net, is a relationship, is trust, is who's got your back. Because I promise, and you all probably know this already, you are absolutely going to fail. But you're not going to fail because of the color of your skin or what you believe in or because of any identifying factor of who you are. You are going to fail because you're human. Right? So the question is, what do you do after that? And this is simply not about being comfortable. And I know for many of you in the room, I don't have to tell you that. Some of us are never comfortable. The question of, showing up and being the only one in the room, whatever that means, the only one in the conversation, the only one at the job, the only one in the classroom. I mean, I have 100 stories, and I'm sure many of you do too, what it means to hold that at the same time. It's been a few years now, but I was listening to NPR, and Michelle Martin was interviewing Svetlana Lazievich, and she's from Belarus, and she'd won a Nobel Prize for her work on Belarus and Chernobyl. And she told some hard and serious truths about Belarus. And a lot of people in her country didn't like it, because it was like she hung out all the dirty laundry and said some things. And Michelle Martin said, "You made a lot of people uncomfortable." And Svetlana Lazievich's response was, "I love my country, but I'm not interested in my people being comfortable. I'm interested in my people being better." Right? So I love that example, and I've told it often because I love the idea of, what does it take to say a thing that you can love a person, a place, a community, who you are, and still call them out. So what does it mean to call them out, to call them in? What does that look like? And how are you supported in order to do that? So I want to come back really briefly here at the end to, for me, often, what does that look like personally in the way that I choose to work in the world and the way that I'm able to work in the world? And I want to come back to my parents. So picture was taken in 2003. This was the last time my parents were on the land. This was actually, I think, the day that they left, and that the new owner took this picture of them. Now, the tree behind them is a weeping cherry tree, Prunus pendula. My father had given my mother that many years back as a wedding gift. And I would often joke, because my father was not a romantic man. I don't know what was happening to him on that day, but it wasn't a bottle of perfume that year, but he gave her the tree. And I thought that was incredibly moving. But they obviously couldn't take the tree with them, right? The roots are embedded in the ground. When my parents went to Leesburg, they got another one just like it. Well, 2020 comes around. One of the things that happened to me, and the reason I've been building this public platform to do this work for years, but it exploded, on sort of an embarrassment of riches the way that I could do it, is because a lot of predominantly white groups and individuals that I had spoken with earlier, who were suddenly going, "Whoa, we have to do more. We have to do work. What can we do? How can we support?" One of those, in 2019, I had been invited to speak at the Telluride Film Festival. It's called Mountain Films, where they do environmental films. And in 2019, the theme had been equity. So they invited Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Privilege, and a bunch of other folks from various backgrounds to come and speak to a predominantly white, very well-heeled audience in Telluride, a lot of filmmakers. It was the whole thing was so incredible. I go back and I think about that because Cheryl Strayed, who wrote the book Wild, she opened the panel. Oprah was there. Like, it was that kind of thing. I was like, this is what they're doing up there on the next level. I see, right? So we had 25 minutes, and I had 25 minutes, and I called it Whose Story Counts. So on the big screen, I had some images of where I grew up. I told the story really quickly, right, in 25 minutes. In 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, one of those filmmakers who I didn't meet that day reached out to me. Is a white filmmaker named Irene Taylor. She'd won Oscars for her documentary film work. She said, "Can we meet on Zoom?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "I'm doing this documentary for HBO on trees. And the way that I want to talk about trees is I want to tell a story about a particular tree in relationship to a real person. And for instance, one of the stories I want to do is the Weyerhaeuser family, who've made a lot of money off timber in this country. She goes, but I realized in thinking back to your story that I didn't have a single story in there about an African American. Could you help me think about what that story might be? And I got really excited and I said, yes, but being a little, jokester I could be, or a little trickster, I kind of said, well, if you're going to tell a story about African Americans and trees in America, you might want to talk about lynching, and I kind of said it like that. And I paused and she kind of did this and went, yeah, you're probably right, but I'm not the person to do that. And then I interjected really quickly. And I said, and we're not just the bad things that happen to us. So I told her the story of the cherry blossom tree and my father, just to give her a different way to think about it. Well, the short of it is she liked it so much. She said, can I tell the story about your family? And then it just became this, sending her old family videos. And, she sent a historian to go and kind of look at the ownership of the estate over time. And it just became a thing. So our family is going to be one of the stories on there. She says, maybe we can get access to the property. Wouldn't that be amazing? I haven't been able to get back home to this property in 18 years. Nobody in my family has. At the same time this was happening, the New York Botanical Gardens reached out and said, would you come here and do a residency? What are you working on? What are you thinking about? And for some reason on Zoom, I told the story again. And she said, you know what, we're the New York Botanical Gardens. We're a major institution. I bet you we could talk to the Westchester Land Trust, get access to the estate, get a sampling of that tree, a grafting, bring it back to the New York Botanical Gardens and tell the story of your family. I can't emphasize to you how deep this was for me in that moment. Because I was like, oh my God, I've told this story hundreds and hundreds of times. My parents believe that they have nothing to leave me or my brothers because they have no land, they don't have money, they feel like they have nothing. And I've been trying to tell them that the legacy, this is the legacy of who they are, right? What they've done here. And so everybody got on board, the filmmakers, the land trust. The plan was we're going to get permission. There's now brand new owners who own this property. It's a white couple who are medical doctors who know nothing about the history, right? So we just need to get permission from them. Meanwhile, the land trust says, well, Carolyn, just to make sure, can you send us a picture of the tree so we know where it is on the property? So I sent them this picture you're looking at now. About a week or two later, they got on the property to look. This is the picture they sent back. The tree had been landscaped. The whole thing was gone. So when this came through, I was devastated. I sent it to the filmmaker who was devastated. And for 3 days, I felt sick to my stomach. I just felt sick to my stomach. I said, it's something so simple, but I watched the whole project go dead in the water because, the whole plan, we're going to have this happy ending kumbaya story, right? But by the 4th day I woke up and I talked to the filmmaker. I said, you know what, this is a story we have to tell because this is what always happens historically in this country. This is the story of erasure. And then when I thought about it a little longer, I said, what if we could get everybody on board here to plant a new weeping cherry tree? Everybody, the land trust, the botanical garden, the filmmakers and the new owner and myself. Because the accountability here is everybody's. I don't want to be the one only responsible to this, right? Because the accountability of my parents' presence is about the relationship, is also the story of this country. How do we tell that? The short version is everybody got on board, but at the last minute, we weren't hearing from the new owners. And the land trust had been working with them. I hadn't gotten involved. And finally I said, just let me write a personal letter. Just let me appeal to them as people, because I imagined they might've been feeling any 100 different things about it. And I wrote them a 1.5-page letter where I never mentioned the word race once. I talked about my parents being Black. I talked about them from South. I said all those things, but I never said race once. The woman wrote me back in 20 minutes and said, yes, we would be honored to, help you honor your family. So last summer on July 13th, there were 10 of us who came up on here and planted a new tree. And I just want to say for those of you in the audience, it looks like I'm doing all the work. I really didn't do all the work. There was a wonderful forester named Brandon who did most of the digging. It was a 95-degree, heat day. I came in, it was more ceremonial, but we all participated in watering the tree, including the new owners. We all participated. There was a young Black filmmaker there named Zaire Love, who was filming what she called the B-roll of the experience. We had the president of the land trust came to be part of it. Representative from New York Botanical Gardens. It was a place that I never imagined I'd be standing, where we now have this new tree. So I think about the question of, well, I often talk about, I'm going to come back to that in a second. I talk about the long game, and the day of the inauguration, President Biden's inauguration, Senator Roy Blount gave him this gift of this painting that you're seeing here. And, you know, I said, oh, it's another one of those bucolic environment paintings from like the 1800s. And I didn't pay much attention to it, except I was noticing the rainbow up in the corner, except that when Senator Blount said, the painter of this is a Black man named Robert S. Duncanson. He painted this painting in 1859. And my ears perked up, in part because he said he was African-American, but because there was a rainbow in the picture. So I want you to think about 1859 for a minute. Slavery was in place. If you had a Black body, you could be property. This man supposedly suffered from mental illness, was often going over the border to Canada, the artist, you know, and yet he painted a picture of a landscape with a rainbow. And rainbow for me is about possibility and potential. And I like to think that he was playing a long game. Exactly 100 years ago, I was born. And I think of all the people who were also born at the same time, without knowing that somehow he was playing a long game. There is no end game here, because for me, there's never an end game to change. It is really a long game, right? And what is it that we need in order to show up? I started off this talk by thanking people, right, who organized the event, and all of you for being here. But here's what I want to say, right? I think that we're playing the long game. Systemic change is lifelong work. You're taking a risk in order to gain. You're looking in a mirror and seeing perhaps for the first time in a different way. We are reminded of everything we don't know, and we're reminded of everything we do know, that we're moving beyond awareness and wokeness and leaning into practice, and that it's going to cost you something. It's already cost a lot of people a lot. It's going to cost me something, because it costs everybody something, right? And I believe we're worth it. The last slide I want to go back to that I skipped over there is this one. And it's kind of appropriate that it looks like broken pieces coming together. So this was just from a couple of weeks ago. The Land Trust promised me that it would get on there and take pictures and to let me know how the tree was doing, right? So you can see that it's just beginning to bloom. I was in Providence, Rhode Island a few weeks ago, when I was about to do sort of my one-woman show where I do a more personal sort of telling of these events to this audience. And I was sitting in my hotel room kind of feeling tired and feeling like a little less than inspired actually on that day, because sometimes it feels that way. And the cost for me is a little heavier when I do the one-woman show, because I'm telling more personal things in it. And this came through in my email. What really moved me and blew me away was not that they simply remembered to send the picture, was that the new owners had decided to plant daffodils. It's not just the daffodils. Something that she could not have known is that daffodils are my father's favorite flower. And in that moment, that was the thing that moved me. It feels small, but there was something about that accountability, about that relationality, about the possibility, about the potential, in all of that, you know, I went in, and at the timing for me was really perfect as well, as I was about to go in and tell this fuller story of this whole thing to an audience and engage with them around the work. So I kind of want to end there. Again, that it's going to cost us all something, but I think we're worth it. And yeah, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Carolyn.